All right, so welcome to the Phoenix DevOps meetup for August. As I mentioned before, my name is Steven. We have about 10-ish, 12 maybe folks in the room here. And then we have another 4 people online. So going forward, we'll probably make it even easier to join remotely via Zoom or some other mechanism. Today, Mr. David Ayers, or Ayers?
Ayers.
Ayers, okay. Is going to present a topic which is near and dear to my heart, which is helping, how do we record decisions, how do we make decisions, especially big decisions around architecture, design, and so forth, and then like persist that knowledge in some way that is straightforward to share and look back on. So thank you, David.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone has a question, how would you like to handle that?
I think we've got plenty of time, so I think just as you have questions, just throw them out.
Great. Thank you, David.
Yep. All right, so obligatory thing about me, I've been building software for a very long time, hence the gray hair and gray beard. Worked at the Container Store in Dallas for about 15 years, helped build their development practices, built a team of about 8 developers to a team of about 60, helped build their DevOps team, and started their journey into the cloud, and then I left. So did a brief consulting stint and landed here in Phoenix at Leslie's Pool Mart, which is headquartered here. And we're in the process of basically re-engineering their entire technology group, starting with a digital transformation and going basically through all of their systems, because there's a lot of work to do there. So I'm passionate about DevOps. I'm passionate about just how we build things and how the processes surrounding building things and making those better. I'm a Phoenix native, but I've been gone for 30 years. I know a lot of people aren't natives anymore, so that's a weird thing to be. But I was born here, went to high school in Scottsdale, and now I'm back. So that's bizarre after 30 years to be back at a place that you haven't been at in a long time. So we do live in interesting times, right? The world is changing. Technology changes at an ever-increasing pace. So as technologists, especially working in agile workplaces, like it's this chaotic landscape that we're forced with. And like you look at the practitioners of agile and the things that they prognosticate, right? You know, it's like you should defer responsibility to the teams and let them make technology decisions and let those people kind of figure things out, right? Which all sounds great in practice, but there's some problems there too, right? So if you have these decentralized decision-making processes, how do you make sure that one team isn't going to do something that sets everyone else off the rails, right? That doesn't consume all the CPU on a certain machine, or build something that floods the network with traffic, or designs things that in their mind or for their app maybe is perfect, but it has a detrimental effect to the rest of your company. So how do you put guardrails around those things, and how do you put some safety nets around those decision-making processes? I happen to agree with a lot of the philosophy that teams should be close to the decision-making, right? And the teams that are building things should be involved in making the decisions, or be allowed to make the decisions themselves within some guide rails. So I'll give you kind of an example from my past about where something like this can go off the rails. So first off, I love MongoDB. This is not a rail against Mongo. It is a tool that has its uses, and used appropriately, it's awesome. So a team kind of said, cool, we're going to build this new thing, and we're going to use Mongo, and it's going to be awesome. It's schemaless, and we can just evolve and do whatever we want. So they went through this rapid development cycle where they were constantly changing the schema, and it was super awesome and great. And then it was time to go to production, right? And what they hadn't done is talk to the ops team. Like, hey, you need to run Mongo in a production environment. That means you mean 3 replicated instances, and you need to have backups, and you need to have process around ensuring that this thing is up. Because for the Container Store, this was a mission critical application. It was the way customers could apply for a private label credit card on a tablet. The back end of that was all a Mongo database. So we ended up launching it, but it just sort of surfaced this problem with this decentralized decision-making, where this team made a decision, and then when it went to go into production, the DBAs and the ops people were like, what are you doing? Like that's not, we use Oracle. Like, why are you doing this Mongo thing? And again, it wasn't Mongo itself that was the problem. It was really just how do you make sure that something like this doesn't happen in your organization? So that kind of got us talking about a lot of ways we could improve processes around this. So today I'm going to talk about 3 specific techniques that we borrowed from the world. We didn't invent any of these. We just applied them to our particular environment and found value in them. So I've become an evangelist for these techniques. So I'm going to kind of talk through what they are, and we can go from there. So here's the problem. Like every developer in history, and I'm sure all of you in this room have looked back and said, what in the crap was I thinking, right? Or even if it wasn't a mistake, you're like, now I see that I wrote this code, but I have no idea why, or what was my thought process at the time, right? So we're good at making decisions, but what we're not good at is socializing those decisions. And by socialization, I mean like sharing with the larger group. Like you've made a decision, maybe that's the best decision for your team or for the organization. And if no one knows about it, it's like, did you even make the decision, right? So how do you socialize the decision? We're also not good at recording decisions, right? We're awesome about having the whiteboard conversation, getting everyone involved and getting the team all on the same page and making a great decision that is the best decision possible. And then everyone goes their merry way. And again, 12 months later, you're like, now, why did we choose Mongo for this? Like no one remembers, right? And what's important is that the context behind those decisions, the reasons you made those decisions are, I think, if not as important or more important than the decision itself, they're certainly very important. Why did you choose Mongo? What were the things you considered and rejected? And what were the reasons why you chose it? Or whatever it is that you chose. I don't want to keep picking on Mongo. So the other thing we're not good at is, new people join our teams all the time, right? So we've made these decisions and the team is awesome. They're this agile, high-performing team. They've gone through the 4 phases, storming, norming, forming, and I got them wrong. Whatever those 4 phases are. I know there's 4 of them. And then a new person joins, right? And so there's all this context that the team shares that there's this person that is over here that has no idea what you're talking about. So what we found on is this Michael Nygaard. He wrote a book called Release It. He's a speaker. He's done a bunch of stuff. He's actually now the chief architect at Sabre in Dallas. So he came up with this idea of architectural decision records. And it wasn't necessarily his idea, the idea that you would record these things. He just sort of codified it in a easy to use, lightweight format that I think is caught on in a lot of places. So I'm going to talk about architectural decisions in projects. So the main use case is I'm building a thing, whether that's an app or a system or whatever, and I want to record decisions that my team is making along the way while I'm building that thing. The second use that we found, maybe even more importantly, was decisions that affect the broader enterprise or things that span multiple teams. And I'll talk about the technique we used to capture those decisions. So often decisions aren't well documented. And if they are documented, they're in some shared drive or maybe on a wiki. By the way, who here uses wikis or Confluence? Keep your hand up if they're well organized and well maintained. Awesome. This is not a rail against Wiki, by the way, or a rail against Confluence. They are excellent, excellent tools that take time and effort to get right. Right? So that's what most people don't do is they're like, oh, we got Confluence. All of our documentation problems are solved. They're not. Like it requires people to make sure that that's the case. So the idea with ADRs is that you document the decisions you're making alongside of the code, right? So this gets checked into version control, into Git, in the project that you're working on, right? So a brand new developer that starts, checks out the project, they go to the ADR folder, and they can immediately read through the decisions that were made to the present day, right? It just sort of gives that context, right? The other thing that putting them in the code base does is allows you to, well, it makes it more likely that it'll happen, right? All this is about like lazy developers, right? I'm a lazy developer. Everyone, like, no one wants to do documentation. No one wants to write anything. You just want to like make some kick-ass app that like is super awesome, and like you don't want to be bothered with that documentation stuff, right? But if you have to like stop what you're doing and like go over to the wiki and like find your team's page and like figure out where to do it, like you're just much less likely to do that. So anything in my mind that eases the friction of doing the documentation, I think is better. So having the documentation right there in the code base where I'm making a change, the documentation is right there. I just pull up a document, or I can change things. It just makes it more likely that it's going to happen. So the other reason why you want to do this, and I mentioned this, is you want to capture the context, right? There's a lot of conversations that happen around these decisions, and you want to capture that context. And so you might wonder, like, who cares? Like, why do you capture the context, right? Well, a couple things happen. So first, someone wants to make a change, right? They want to introduce React, or they want to change everything from Angular to React. And they're like, Angular super sucks, React is the new hotness, totally want this on my resume, so I'm gonna change it to React, right? So they have two choices. They can just say, well, I guess what they knew, they chose Angular, so they must know better than I do. So they can blindly accept that the original decision was the best decision, right? Which might be the right answer, given the constraints of the team and given the environment. Not changing might be the right answer. The other thing is they could just blindly make the change, right? They can just start introducing React pages into the app and not caring about the decisions that were made in the past, which also might be the right decision, right? But what you don't know is in the absence of any of the context of those discussions and those decisions and why they were made, it just gives you much less of a feeling for anyone to make a change, right? And I've run into this so many times in my career where you like start to do something, you're like, man, this feels familiar. Like, this seems like we've talked about this before. Like, why did we? Oh, you're like, oh, right. That one meeting 7 months ago where we all agreed to do X, whatever it is. So now we'll get into the meat of it, talking about what an ADR is. So ADR is Architectural Decision Record. And there's an interesting, quick aside. Some people, since I left the Container Store, they've actually just changed this to decision record, because if you start to look at what this is, it's not just an architectural decision, right? You could use this format literally for any decision you make as an organization. So I don't really have much to say on that because I wasn't there when we did it, but it makes total sense to me that any decision you make, be it a business decision, a technical decision, a design decision, could be recorded in the same way. So it's a text document, most commonly in Markdown. You'll see, if you look around, you'll see other people do it in other formats. You create one ADR per file. So meaning a single decision lives in a single file. That file, generally speaking, follows a naming convention. So decisions are numbered, and they have a file name that looks something like this, which briefly describes the topic of the decision. So they're saved in an ADR folder with the project. So at basically the top level of the project, next to your source directory, you create a directory called ADR. And then your first decision goes into that as 001. And generally speaking, this is the first decision that a lot of people put in their projects. I think it's a little cheesy, but the decision to use Markdown to document ADRs. And there's actually a tool that Nat Price, anyone know who Nat Price is? He's a developer. He's written a bunch of testing tools and other things. But he wrote a tool called, I think it's ADR tool. It's a command line tool for doing ADRs. And by default, it creates, like when you initialize it, it will create a repo with 2 decisions in it. 1 to use ADRs and 2 to use Markdown for your ADRs. I think the tool's a little overweight. Like, it's a text file. Like, you don't need a tool. Like, it'll do stuff like, oh, it'll figure out like, oh, you're on decision number 23. It'll, like, the next one you create, it'll automatically figure out that it's 24. Like, that's hard. Anyway, so the format basically breaks down to the title. It's usually a simple phrase like use Git for version control, LDAP for authentication, React for front-end development, something. Status. So this is one that we started off using sort of the recommended way of doing this. So the statuses that exist by default, well, that are recommended are accepted, proposed, superseded, or deprecated. And the original idea is that these decisions are immutable. Once you make a decision, the only way to do it is to supersede it with another decision, or to say, we're not doing that anymore and just deprecate the decision entirely. So we started doing it that way. And what we found in practice for very active projects that are making a lot of decisions, you end up with a lot of noise in your ADR directory, right? You just end up with a lot of things, and it's not really clear just from looking at them, well, which ones of these are still in effect, right? Because I may have deprecated 3 of them, I may have 4 of them are superseded by 4 others. So we ended up, like, crazy concept, using version control rather than these statuses as a way to track these things. So we removed the sort of requirement that decisions be immutable, and if you wanted to change a decision, then you would propose a change in the form of a pull request, and then go through a process of review, and once that was accepted, that new decision would be in place. And then if things were deprecated, we created a deprecated directory and moved the files to that directory, so that basically you'd know that anything that was in the top level directory are decisions that are in force right now and that are still applicable. Your mileage may vary. Again, this is one of those things that I think you need to figure out what works for your workflow. And it was a very conscious decision. We went with the recommended findings and found some things that didn't work for our workflow, which I think is what most people should do, is not just take something that someone says is best practices. I hate that word, but don't use someone else's best practices. Like, you can use them as a guideline and then make them your own. Anyway, so the context, right? So this is probably the most important of an ADR, a piece of an ADR. So this describes the forces in play in factual, non-judgmental language, right? Because some of these things, like, are controversial. And these things, like, tabs versus spaces, like, we actually had those religious wars, and we ended up with ADRs about how we were going to do Java code formatting. And we had the tab versus space war, and people are, like, unreasonably passionate on both sides, right? It doesn't make any sense why people care as much as they do, but they do. So you have to keep into account, like, this is a document where you're trying to describe as, like, you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings is the point here, right? Like, keep in mind that their people's opinions are important to them, and you have to describe this in a way that's as neutral as possible, right? And by the way, that tension is not a bad thing. Like, having tension and strong opinions is awesome, right? Diversity of opinion is what makes all our teams great. And then you describe the decision itself. Usually this is the shortest part of the document because the decision is usually something straightforward. This is the one that says, we will record architectural decisions in Markdown format. And then there's consequences. So every decision has consequences for good or ill, right? So you can say, using Markdown has limitations, and it means that we can't automatically do certain things. If it were in HTML, you might be able to do things differently. And you need a rendering engine to show Markdown, which luckily enough, most of us use GitHub, and it will render Markdown pages automatically. But if you don't, you might need some render. So those are just some examples. And you should record the things that you realized as you were doing this. You knew that there were limitations or consequences or ramifications for the decision you made. So the idea is that these are short and to the point, right? This is not like a dissertation, right? You're not trying to get published somewhere. You're trying to record the salient facts in a short text document that's easy to consume. Right, so what about those concerns that span across projects, right? There are some things that you're going to decide as an organization that you're just going to do for everyone. Like, we are going to use GitHub as our single source for everyone and their source repository. We are going to use pull requests as the way to review code, or whatever it is. We're going to use mob programming, whatever your styles are. A lot of those things can be expressed across teams. So I'm going to pop out real quick. Hopefully this doesn't mess up the screen share, because I have to share another screen. Oh, what happened? Nope. There one. Okay, so I'm going to show some examples. So what we ended up doing is we created a top-level repository in GitHub called Technical Architecture, right? And that repository contained all of the documents related to our overall technical architecture. So it had a directory for ADRs. It also had diagrams for how our systems connected. And it basically, like, it became the single place where we sort of described how our business worked together. It was a Container Store, as a retailer, very complex systems, very complex interactions. So we use that place as a way to have a single repository for everything about our business. related to technology. So there's an ADR directory, and these are actual, I've cleansed them of any facts related to container store, but these are the actual decisions that we made. Decisions 5, 8, and 18. So real quickly, I'll go through these. So the decision number 5 was how we were going to do versioning, right? We were a polyglot development shop. We did Rails, Node, and Java development. We were moving to Docker for all of our development. This was 2 years ago. I don't know what they're doing now. So anyway, so we needed some common way to how we're going to express version numbering across our platform. So this is basically a thing that says, here's the context. We have a bunch of different applications, libraries, and multiple environments. We want to follow industry conventions for reasons, because then we can use tooling and we use other things that understand things. We want to be able to uniquely identify each artifact. So in our build system, we want to be able to build an artifact and show that that is the exact artifact that progressed all the way through our environments and landed in production. So just kind of expressing a lot of the context. And these are the things that we talked about that were important to us in choosing a version system. So there's a lot of stuff here. And we kind of separated the fact that libraries are different than applications. If you're building something that's just the library, maybe it has slightly different rules. And then here's the decision, which is we're going to use Semver, which is an industry standard for versioning, right? And Semver itself has a bit of ambiguity because there's like basically after the, I think it's after the dash, you can kind of do whatever you want, right? So so we kind of define, okay, here's what we're going to do after the dash, and here's what those things mean. So again, this is just an example of something, and this applied to all of our projects. So for things that don't intrinsically have a version number, like Rails applications, like you just have a bunch of files, right? You're not like publishing an artifact. So we in the, I'll talk about working groups in a minute. The Ruby working group, they agreed that they would have a version that was checked into version control in a file called version.txt, right? So they introduced versioning into a system that didn't really have versioning, and that file would automatically get incremented by the build system as part of the build process. That make sense? Any questions about this? So we'll look at a couple more. So we also did a bunch of database development. We were very heavy in using stored procedures. I do not recommend, but it was what it was. A lot of legacy stuff using Oracle stored packages. So we spent a lot of time talking about how do you manage those things, right? Because there aren't tools. Well, we ended up adopting a tool for doing migrations. If you use Rails at all, you know they've got a great way for doing migrations. There's a tool called Flyway that we ended up using that we built a whole migration system that could be database agnostic and language agnostic. In the course of that, we spent a lot of time talking about, oh, that's funny, I forgot the link to the wiki. That's not going to work. No one saw that, right? This isn't being recorded, right? So we came up with different kinds of schemas in our database as we went through how we do database development. So there are system schemas, DBA schemas, application user schemas, individual user schemas, and replication schemas, domain schemas. So basically, we just kind of defined, this is how we do database development, and everyone that's doing database development should follow these specifications for how you set up schemas and what those schemas are used for. So this is another example, and then so we recorded all the details, recognized some consequences that we have a bunch of large legacy schemas that aren't going to follow these rules, and over time we'll change them and adopt them to use this. So the last one is how we did secrets. So we started using Vault for secrets. And if you're familiar with Console or Vault, essentially they're just key value stores that you can build paths around. And those paths can mean anything you want, right? So you can build paths to keys in Console, which are in clear text. And Vault essentially does the same thing, but provides access to secrets that you need special ways to get at and special permissions to access those secrets. So we're using Vault as part of our Docker build infrastructure. This is before Kubernetes. So we said, here's how we're going to store secrets in Vault. And this is the pathing that we're going to use to access and store those secrets. So it's essentially just a path structure that says what kind of usage it is, what environments for, dev, test, and production, what is the scope, and then what is the key. So just some examples, like database passwords. So you have a database instance called foo with a user called example. So this would be the password for the dev, test, and production environment in our decision. TLS certificates, so you could also store certificates for TLS encryption. So this is the paths that we use for that. So again, just an example of how we built these decision records for things that applied across many different things in our architecture. I'll pause there for a second while I'm switching back for any questions. No? Okay. Is that good? Yeah, I went to the share. That's what I did. All right, excellent. Okay, so the good thing about ADRs in our experience was that it helped us, it reused our existing code review process. So we used pull request as our way of getting code into trunk. People were familiar with that. And it really allowed us to leverage that workflow. So if you wanted to propose change to an existing ADR or something new in the architecture, you propose that in the form of a pull request. There's a bunch of discussion that could happen, revisions can happen over time, and then eventually that could get pulled into the code base as meaning that that ADR is now accepted. So no one had to learn a new process, they didn't have to learn a new way of doing things, and it worked really well. So overall, ADRs proved to be a powerful tool that helped codify a lot of the decisions we're making, record them, and allowed them to be socialized much easier. So this starts to nibble at socialization, right? This isn't the solution for socialization, but having them in a shared place where everyone knows where they are, like starts, right? Someone can go, oh, what's the latest? What's going on with the company decisions, or what's going on with my project? And if you're on a project team, you'll see these come up as you see pull requests for them. So it begins to address some of the socialization problem. It doesn't solve it. So another thing that we started doing at the Container Store was publishing a newsletter. Like, as goofy as that sounds, and the guy who wrote it was super goofy because you probably can't read it really well, but they're filled with puns and they're trying to engage people and they're funny. But basically there was this sort of digest that went out that told people, everyone on the team, like, hey, we made some decisions recently. They're awesome. You should go learn about them, right? So it's just, it's like anything. Socialization especially is not a problem that you can apply a hammer to, right? You have to bring a toolbox to solve socialization, right? You have to bring a variety of ways to help these decisions get around the organization. So this is one of the ways that we found particularly effective at communicating decisions, especially as we made new decisions. It was a really great way of saying, hey, everyone go check this thing out. So you don't have to just take my word for it. Is everyone familiar with ThoughtWorks Technology Radar? If you're not, familiarize yourself. It's a really great way to kind of see what's happening in the world of technology and what kind of things are gaining traction or falling out of favor. But they have several phases in their radar, and the last phase is you should do this, which is their adopt phase. So this is like, I think it's almost 2 years ago now at this point, where they said, hey, everyone should adopt these. They're awesome. And if you actually go to the Technology Radar, they have a whole article about ADRs as well. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, enterprise architecture guilds. So, so as we've adopted new approaches for teams, and we've brought together cross-functional resources on all of our teams, and we've embedded QA and UX and design, and we built this awesome cross-functional team. And the Amazon thing about 2 pizza teams, everyone's heard that, right? Like, you should, which by the way, I think is full of crap, because serving size for pizza is like 1 pizza. Like, or half a pizza. Like who eats, like 8 people can eat 2 pizzas? Anyway. So they have free reign to make technology decisions, right? The teams are empowered now to figure out the best thing for them. And if you work in a big enterprise, you've got a role called an enterprise architect, most likely, right? And they're all sad now because they're trying to figure out what their job is in this new world, right? I've got a version of this talk that I've given to enterprise architects at large companies because their world has changed and it's for the better. And I think I'm not going to go into all the reasons why it benefits them, but they could be a big help in doing a lot of this stuff. Anyway, but they're all sad because they don't know how they fit into this new world. So one approach that's worked well and that I totally stole from other people was creating this idea of creating a guild, right? So if Spotify has published a bunch of stuff about how they built their engineering culture, it's an awesome read. I recommend you read it. I don't recommend you do it, right? That's what they tell you is like, don't do this. It worked for us. It's probably not going to work for you. So I borrowed some of their ideas. I didn't like I've seen some people literally that took the Spotify model and implemented it like exactly. And they've all failed because it only worked for Spotify because they're Spotify. So you can go read about this. They've got this concept of guilds. What I did wasn't exactly the same as what they do, right? So the guild was open to everyone that wanted to attend, right? So this is egalitarian. Anyone that was interested in architecture, like I want those people. Like anyone who has an interest, whether they're a developer that just started with you, that just got out of school, if they're interested in this stuff, give them an outlet for that interest. Don't make them feel like, well, you're too junior for this particular thing. You're not good enough to join our club. Like it was inclusive. Anyone that wanted to come could come. Which made for big meetings, right? We had sometimes 30 or 40 people in these meetings. So we learned over time how to impose some structure. I'm going to go through some of those things. One of the things is you can't make a decision in a room of 30 people, right? It's impossible. You can have great, lively discussions. You can hear people's opinions. And those things were awesome. And they were great ways to sort of hear fledgling ideas. Someone will kind of bring up a thing like, hey, what about this React thing? Like maybe we should check that out. This was several years ago. What responsibilities did we give the guild? The first of them was write ADRs, right? So often the conversation would go like, hey, I've got this awesome idea. I think we should try to use React or Angular or XYZ, whatever it is, Mongo. I think we should try this. We're like, cool. Is anyone else interested in that? And you'd find 3 or 4 people that are interested in that thing. And you say, you guys go off and talk amongst yourselves and write an ADR. Right, so that was the first way that we used the group as sort of a spawning ground for ADRs. Now that could be a project-specific ADR, it could be an enterprise-wide ADR. And those were usually very tactical that maybe didn't have a lot of tentacles into other areas or a lot of effect on other areas. The second thing is we would form short-term special interest groups. So out of the the architecture guild, we would nominate several people who shared an interest. So the thing that came up was Docker. We're like, hey, we want to go to Docker. We're tired of deploying Rails apps and Node apps and Java apps 3 different ways. What if we could deploy them all the same way in a Docker container? So we got a group of 5 or 6 people that were really interested in that, and we formed a SIG, right? And we knew that was going to have a lifetime, right? It wasn't something that needed to last forever. We needed to make a bunch of decisions about how we're going to use Docker. And then once those decisions were codified in the form of ADRs, we could dissolve that guild, dissolve that special interest group. So that's what we did. And they formed that ADR on Vault was one of the ADRs that they formulated. And then what our standards for Docker were and what our standards for how we do a bunch of stuff in Docker. The last thing is long-running SIGs. So there are many things, and for sure we had them in all of our major language groups. So we again, polyglot development, 3 different languages that we supported. Each of them had a long-running SIG. Right, so the Java guy, 3 months now, how do we handle that? Like, how do you even possibly do that? And the Ruby guys would talk about whatever they talk about, because I'm not a Ruby guy. And then the Node guys would talk about, like, why is JavaScript so terrible? No, they wouldn't. I'm kidding. JavaScript's fine. And then we also had a database development group. Again, we did a ton of Oracle stored procedures. So we had a sort of we knew that we were going to be in that business for a long time. So we had a group of people to say, how do you make database development not suck, right? Because if you've done Oracle development, you know it probably sucks. So how do you make it suck less? And again, the primary output of those long-term SIGs are ADRs, right? So that's generally speaking, you can see a pattern here, right? This group was formed of like-minded people interested in solving interesting problems and coming up with ways that can influence either their team or the company at large. Does anyone here work at a company that has an architecture review board? So it's I think less common now maybe than it was. A lot of big companies used to have these, some still do. And we had at the Container Store, I would say we had a very lightweight. It was sort of me and a couple of the other directors that were like, we would strong arm people into telling them they couldn't do stuff. And we heard this guy's over here messing with something. We're like, no, that's not one of the things we do. So ultimately what we decided is I was a VP at the time, and I decided to sort of cede the authority of the architecture review board to the guild, right? And let them collectively make decisions, right? And that's scary. I was like, oh my God, what am I thinking? And so I told them that I retained like this veto power. Like if I thought they were making a horrible decision, I still had the red button where I could punch out and stop it, which I never had to use, right? Like I think most of us work with people who care deeply about what they do and are willing to listen to arguments and are willing to make great decisions if you give them the authority and the power to do so. Right? And that was my experience. We never had a case where they made a terrible decision that was, irrevocable for the company. Yeah, they made mistakes. Yeah, we try stuff. We're like, gosh, the Vault thing, I know for a fact because I was talking to my friend who still works there. Like the way we did Vault, totally wrong, right? So we later came back and did it differently, right? So they did another ADR, and it was not a irreversible decision. So the other thing it started to help with, and again, this is that thing with socialization, right? Several different avenues to address how you socialize decisions. Everyone in that guild cared, right? They were an evangelist for, number one, it's awesome that I get to participate in this level of decision making at any company, because I think it's unusual for a lot of developers in a lot of places. So they cared a lot, and they would become evangelists. They'd be like, oh my gosh, did you see this cool thing? And they would go tell their teams about it, and then they'd tell two friends, and sorry, that old commercial. But they really did become evangelists in terms of spreading the word of the guild. And they would, like, I would see people like, especially with new developers, are like, hey, how do you do this database stuff? And you'd have like 3 people jump in and like explain, here's the ADRs about how we do database development, and here's our approach, and here's how you do it. And they're like, wow, this is awesome. All right, so it begins to, again, it's another thing that gets to how you start socializing these decisions. So the meetings all had a set agenda, right? So every meeting, we would have a report from every SIG on what they're working on, what ADRs they're working on. Those were usually pretty quick, because the long-running SIGs and even the short-term SIGs, there usually weren't that many of them with a lot to report. These meetings were monthly, by the way. So we had monthly Architecture Guild meetings. And they lasted usually an hour. Sometimes they would go to an hour and a half if there were super lively discussions. And then we would decide, like we had an agenda item that said, the short-term SIG, should we kill it? Like, right, there's no reason to continue to put effort into something that's reached the end of its life. So I firmly believe that you should think about those things proactively rather than just sort of like, one day you realize that the Docker Guild has been going for 2 years and hasn't really done anything for the last 18 months. And then we'd review and discuss ADRs, either voting to adopt them or sending them back for more work and discussion. So usually the person would be like, okay, I'm ready for my decision. They do a short presentation on what it is. Often it's not the first time anyone's seen it because it's a pull request that's already out there that's had lots of decision. And then we would vote on it. And then it would either get approved or sent back for more work and then brought up again. And then this was the most interesting part, is like, hey, what's going on? What are people thinking? You have this great discussion about how we could make our processes better, or what new things we could adopt, or what things we should be thinking about. So the cool thing is, obviously I stole this from Spotify, so it's out there. But I ran across this really interesting article about Comcast, and it's linked here. By the way, all of these slides are on GitHub. So the link is on the last page, and I'll also post the link to the meetup page when we're done. But there's this great article about how Comcast is using architectural guilds to build ADRs. Like they saw my presentation and they're like, that's awesome. And then they did it with 800 people. They didn't, but so they have 800 people across their organization in their architecture guild, right? So it's obviously structured very different than the one I talked about, right? It's very decentralized, and they modeled it on how the internet, IETF, does their steering groups and working groups for deciding standards for the internet, right? So each working group has a charter as a markdown document in GitHub, and then each working group produces ADRs or contributes to ADRs from other groups. And they really found, I mean, a lot of benefits, the things I've already talked about, but the coolest thing to me is that they realized there was this community out there that had been underserved, right? There's this community of people that really cared about architecture and really cared about design, and they emerged as a result of this. So now that they've kind of tapped into this wellspring of experience that they weren't really getting at before. They also found accelerated decision-making by decentralized decision-making process, because they had an architecture review board and literally it would just take forever to get any particular decision approved. They delegated authority and allowed people to make decisions at lower levels and saw an acceleration in that decision process. And then really the crowdsourcing, it's kind of summing up, but they saw crowdsourcing the charters and crowdsourcing the ADRs really, again, helped them proceed in ways that they would have been, the bureaucracy of Comcast would have stopped them. So it's a great article. I recommend it. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is building reference implementations. And again, the idea here is how do we communicate architecture decisions, right? So we've talked about several ways that you can communicate the decisions you can make. I think reference implementation is the most powerful way that you can do it, right? So when I worked at Container Store, we had a complex environment. You've heard a couple of things about it, right? But we had Docker, we had Vault, we had Console for service discovery, we did Java with Spring Boot. So that was the Java stack, right? And there was a similarly complex stack on the Node side and a similarly complex stack on the Ruby side. So how do you make all these things work together? Like, it's daunting. You're like, hey, I need to make a new application for whatever it is. You're like, well, crap, I have to learn 47 things in order to make that happen and deploy my app in production, right? So what we started to do is figure out what we could do to make that process easier, right? So it served two ends. One is we'd made a bunch of decisions about how we should do Vault and how we should do Console and how we should do Docker. So we codified those decisions in the form of a reference application that sort of had all of the scaffolding necessary so that you could literally like start right. It was like a hello world application that you could run and it would do something. And we had those for Node and for Rails and for Spring Boot. And it took care of all of the wiring. It took care of all of the Docker stuff, and it was awesome, right? So it was a Kickstarter to get a project started, and it was a concrete implementation of the things described in the ADRs. Right, so again, it helped. You could read the ADRs and understand what you were saying, and then you could look at the code and translate those decisions into what that means for me as a developer. So it baked in best practice. Yeah, I need to change this because I really do hate that word. But our best practices, right? The practices that work for us. Things like linting, right? Like all of the teams had agreed on their code formats. And this had linters built in, so code style for Java and whatever ESLint for JavaScript and whatever the tools were, those were built into the build process. So you couldn't mess up the formatting we'd agreed on. Static code analysis, so we use different tools for static code analysis like find bugs and other things, PMD, and those were baked into our build processes. Security, so this was an area that we needed to work on, but again, it started to address it by like having how we do secret management as part of this. And part of this also was build chains, right? So we'd have predefined build chains that went along. So I'm going to build a Java thing. There's a build chain for the Java thing that you could start from that had some things in there like find bugs and PMD and other, like all of those things were built into both the build process and the code itself. So it's everything you needed to get started working on something. In the real world, like, you know, I think the downside of this, right, is you don't do this unless you're committing to it, right? Because it will fail. So we had a structure in place that allowed us to do this, right? We had working groups that met, I think they met every other week, the SIGs, and they were responsible for maintaining the reference implementations for their language. And as new decisions happened, they would update the reference implementation to reflect those new decisions, right? So it requires two things. One, it requires a management team that's willing to give you the time to do that. I know that's not necessarily possible everywhere, right? So this technique does have a cost, but I think the benefit is, I mean, imagine if you can clone a project, copy a build path in your CI system, and literally have an application deployed in about 5 minutes. So it was very powerful. And at the time, and I know they still are, like, they were spinning up new things all the time, like doing greenfield development on a lot of new things. Cutting that time, I mean, you guys know, like, you're gonna start a project, you do a bunch of stuff locally, and then it'll take you like 2 days to work with the ops guys to figure out, like, to provision you a thing and do a thing, and unless you've got Kubernetes running, and then good luck. Kubernetes is awesome, but it's very complex. Sorry. So we built, I talked about other reference implementations already, so well, I'm way off my slides. Well worth the effort. Okay. So any questions about reference implementations? All right. So I want to talk about, this is more of an architectural technique, but I think it's also a good way to, at the beginning of a project, build a common understanding amongst your team, right? Because that's probably one of the hardest things you can do, especially when you're starting something, right? Like 1 or 2 or 3 people might have an idea how to do things and how things are going to connect, but how do you make sure everyone has that shared vision in their head, right? So this goes along with how do you communicate architectural ideas. And this technique works especially well at the beginning of a project or when you're maybe connecting something brand new. So I've heard it called a couple of things. One is I've heard it called a steel thread, and I've heard it called a tracer bullet. And the idea is that you build the minimum functionality that touches every single piece of your application in a working way, right? So it's not just fake, right? Like if you've got a React thing that's talking to a Node backend, that's talking to an Oracle database, that's also talking to an authentication web service, that's also talking to an inventory web service. Build the bare minimum, and like the UI can be ugly, like you don't have to apply look and feel, but what can you build in each of those areas that proves that you can, I mean, number one, it proves that you can connect, because at least every place I've always been, the security guys with their firewall rules won't let anybody talk to anybody, right? So the number one problem is like, I go to production and then nothing can talk to it. So it's like the sooner you surface those kind of basic problems, the better you're going to be and the more prepared you're going to be. You're like, oh, I now realize I have to open these 6 new ports on the firewall for these different things to talk to each other. And it also then gives a scaffolding for the rest of the team to build on, right? And it helps build that shared common understanding amongst the team about how those different layers connect, right? Does that all make sense? So that's what I have today. Thanks for your time. My contact information, oh yeah, so I did this talk at the Lead Developer Conference. If you manage people at all, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best conferences I've ever been to. But anyone seen these Sketchnotes? Like this is a thing she did while I was presenting. And like at the end of the presentation, she had this done. So I just thought it was super awesome and wanted to share it. It's also on the repo. You can see a bigger picture of it. You can see, like, this is my favorite part. Right here, she's like, but I love MongoDB. So that's it. That's me.
How do you decide that decision is the process? At what point do you, it's too big of a decision for you, the developer?
So, yeah, so the question was, like, at what point does a decision rise to the level of needing an ADR? And I would say there isn't an easy answer to that question, right? It's like how long does something take? Right? Can you estimate this for me? Like, it's that kind of question, because It depends on your environment and your team and the maturity of your team. But what I would recommend is the cost is relatively low, right? I think the way you do this is not, you're not writing a 20-page document. You're writing a one-pager that says, here's what it is. So given that the cost is low, I would tend to do it as, like, do it all the time. Like, and then some of this is like, start and say like, hey, every decision you're gonna make, write an ADR. And then you'll get to a point you're like, well, gosh, you know, if you're doing sprint retrospectives, you can look back and say, hey, this sprint, we wrote 7 ADRs. Let's look at them. Did we need to do that? So I mean, I think it's, you have to kind of fine tune it for your team as to I know that's a crappy answer, but like, to me, we started doing it for almost everything, and we honestly kept doing it for most things. So it's not like, you know, developers like, what should I name this method? I'll do an ADR. Like, you know, it wasn't that bad, but I mean, developers make micro decisions every day, right? And some of those are totally fine and they don't affect the team. And some of them are like, you know, I'm gonna add Redux to this React app, right? That has implications for state management and how the team works. So that's not something I would do lightly. You know, it's maybe a terrible example, but.
So I have a prompt in my retrospective template that just says decisions, and that way you're not too far, you're never too far from when any decision might be made to see that and then spend an hour or two writing.
Yeah, and that's a good, so we went, at the beginning of this process, we went back and documented probably a dozen decisions that had already been made, right? And tried to, like, a lot of times you'd have to rehab those conversations, like, now, why did we choose X? And we'd have to have the conversations again, but then at least because we wanted to start somewhere. And we knew there were core things to the way we were building software. So, yeah, no, that's a good way to do it. Okay.
So how does a decision record relate to design document or architecture description of there? And you alluded to it at one point when, well, the engineers have done a presentation or whatever about it. But what's clear about it?
So, yeah, this is another one where, like, it's, I believe that you need to, especially at the beginning of the project, have some level of those things. So, like, what we tended to go towards was lighter weight on the documentation and keeping it mostly in GitHub. So, like, the READMEs for our projects tended to include, like, an architecture diagram for how that particular system worked, what its major components were, and the systems it connected to. So, and that was we used Google Drawings, and you can embed the drawing in your thing, and it was a live drawing. So any updates that were made in the drawing were updated on the GitHub page. So we tended to do more diagramming. And then if there was sort of narrative about the overall architecture of the project, we kept most of it in the README of the repo. And again, the idea is that, like, as a new developer, what are the things that I want to know about this project? Or as someone that, like, maybe you wrote a web service and I'm a consumer of your service. So I can go to your repo and read what it does and how it works. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but it's, okay. I forgot to repeat the question. Sorry, everyone.
My question is, do you ever regret putting the ADRs into version control? Because on decisions that involve larger areas of business, you have no access to version control. They make it more difficult for them to participate in that process. So if you've gone to the maybe gone sometimes or consider a person marketing or procurement, something like that, in the decision that might affect them.
So a couple of things I didn't talk about, and that's actually a good follow-up. I need to, sorry, the question was, did we ever regret using source control and markdown because by its nature it excludes certain people like marketing or anyone in the business side. They're not necessarily going to understand those tools. So I think the answer is yes. And I think as I was leaving, the solution they were going to, so there were a couple of things, and I can, well, we added a section in the ADRs for related topics. So that was a new section that wasn't in the ADR spec, and they were essentially like hashtags or keywords, and wrote some very simple stuff that parsed the documents and built an index. So you could see like, here's all the decisions related to database, and here's all the decisions related to. So the plan as I was leaving was to have something that essentially with a commit hook on GitHub as those things changed, to republish the sort of canonical version that anyone could read. So, and they were, as I left, they were talking about, should we do this to Confluence, or should we just make a website that publishes our decisions in a more easily consumable format? So, and I mean, that's not a lot of tooling, right? There's a ton of stuff out there that takes markdown documents and converts them to HTML files, and we parsed the things and then built an index of documents. So it was a collection of bash scripts that did it, that published the sites to a set of HTML files. I just don't remember. So you could imagine, without a lot of effort, building something that pushed that to Confluence, or that pushed it just to a website that was published on each commit. So it's not, I mean, there's still a little bit of a disconnect there, because those people can't necessarily participate in the discussion around those things. But it's interesting, there are several uses of GitHub that are occurring in the world now for non-technical things, like people are using it to write laws and propose changes to laws. So like if legislators can understand it, maybe it's a stretch. But like, I think there's some basics you could show someone on, like, hey, here's a pull request and here's how you make a comment. You know, it's perhaps a bit daunting, but it's not unachievable.
You ever experienced where a well-socialized decision and standardized more easily across organizations, but perhaps standardization has some negative implications in the long run, where things get too standardized and people aren't seeking out new ways of doing things because all of that standardization is so well standardized.
So the question was, have I ever run into an instance where we've done such an awesome job at socializing things that people are afraid to make changes or don't even realize they can make changes? I'm paraphrasing. Does that sum it up? Or that it's just become sort of that institutional knowledge, like, of course, that's the way we do it. We've always done it that way. I mean, my honest answer is I haven't. But I think a lot of that has to do with the culture that you build in your organization. And you know, we just had a great group of people that all cared very deeply and knew what the process was. I mean, so I think we've done a really good job sort of socializing even the process. So we never had a lack of someone saying like, hey, do we still want to do it this way? Or so again, I think that spoke a lot to the kind of ability people had to affect their environment in a positive way, and that people could suggest change and see the result of that and not be then afraid to suggest more change. And that's probably much harder to achieve than just writing some ADRs. Like solving your company culture or your development group's culture is a complex problem. So I'm sorry I don't have any good advice other than have an awesome culture, and that makes it easy.
Awesome. Thank you, David. We did